So Barry, can I pass things over to you? Would you like to begin?
Sure. Thanks, Anne. Thanks everybody who's here and in person and those online for coming to this presentation, as Anne mentioned. So it's nice to give, a presentation that includes all the team members. So I'll speak, Tracy will speak, Skylar and Sabrina. So we'll each get turns to talk about things. So it's like a baton, we'll hand it back and forth. And then I'll mention the talk is about emerging dual use technology, and today's Remembrance Day, so it's quite appropriate. I think in remembering the troops, also, talking about these technologies and the dual use purpose. So the timing, I think, is quite good. And then what we'll talk about is the need for a guiding frame for emerging dual use technology and how that guiding frame will work. That's the idea. I want to mention, as you heard in the introduction, I'm a quantum physicist, so I really am stepping into uncharted territory here. This is an early stage of our research program. So I'm laying out what we're going to do. And I don't have a lot of results to say, neither do the team members. So it's really the map going forward on how to address it. So the idea of this presentation is to make clear what we're going to do, why we need it, and not to deliver the result here. So I hope all that makes sense. Come on in. Okay.
Let me just click on the, there you go.
Okay.
Should be good now.
Okay, so first of all, what is emerging dual use technology? I'm a pictures person. I think in pictures, not words. So we did lots of pictures here. Unfortunately, we only finished the presentation 15 minutes ago. So it's that's actually good because some I don't get done till 5 minutes after the start time. So we're well ahead of the curve on this. But the idea here is, to capture pictures. So if we were prepared in advance and responsible, we'd be preparing our own pictures. Here, it's just what picture on the internet or that we can generate would represent the idea. And to give credit, we've used the tiny URL reference. So I won't say where each source is, but sources are referenced by tiny URL. In cases where we don't have the reference, it's either Wikimedia, which are the figures for Wikipedia, or from stock images where we're allowed to do it. So in the cases you don't see an attribution, it's Wikimedia or stock images. Okay. So the first thing is, so we have to take it apart. Emerging dual use technology. So I want to explain what is emerging, what's the dual use, and what's the technology. And so on the emerging side, it combines two things. So there's a fast car and a roadmap. And what makes an area emerging is characterized roughly, what I want is kind of a smell test as I think about it, and actually use this in coding theory. So, if you do high level codes and you want to detect errors, they actually talk about it as a smell test. You can smell a problem in the code by looking at it overall. So it's kind of like what is the smell that tells us it's emerging? So the way I think about it is it's moving very fast. So it's a fast moving area. It's attracting resources, talent, etc. And kind of building a community very quickly because there's a sense in a growing community that the area is very promising and it's highly competitive and urgent. So that's the emerging very fast for a number of reasons. And then the idea when you do technology development, and certainly in the roles I play mentoring a lot of startup companies, the standard question is, what's your technology roadmap? And then we do have startups in quantum. Quantum will keep emerging. I just want to tell you that quantum will come up, certainly what I say and what Tracy says too, not because this is about quantum, but because, we have experiences with quantum as a way of learning lessons. But I'm not selling quantum. And the way in Hollywood, there's typecasting of actors. Don't typecast me as quantum, but I'll mention quantum now and then. So the idea is that the roadmap is unclear. And it's actually one of the interesting problems in emerging dual use technology. How do you create an ecosystem with companies that have market pull when we don't know what the market will be and the roadmap is difficult? So these are some of the challenges that come out, certainly ones that I feel in helping both companies, startup companies, and also investors considering what is the case for investing in the area. Okay, the dual use is also really interesting. And the timing is particularly good because the federal budget came out last week. And so in my round off numbers, it's 2/3 of $1 billion roughly allocated over, I think, 5 years for dual use technology. And I had a chance to speak to some people who are tasked with, how do we turn this budget into real, how do we channel it through the government system into the right pots? And that's kind of a big thing I understand people are thinking about. And so one of the big questions is, what is dual use? We'll go into this a bit later, but the fact that the federal budget includes a big component for dual use means that we have to know what dual use means, and that's not that straightforward. So we're working on that, and included in our project is a typology of dual use that comes up. And then what is technology? We use the term all the time, but really technology is about taking a conceptual framework that's built out of our experiences in science and engineering and building something that will deliver value. So this is where technology lies. So the idea here is that understanding the concepts that emerge, what can we build, what will it do, how will it operate? Eventually, there's things like product market fit, the effects on security. So this is the emerging dual use technology framework, and the literature is really limited in the area on this. Okay, next slide.
No, you can, I think that.
Okay, I'll do it.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the other part of the title is on the guiding front. Now, as I said, like I come in as a neophyte. So these are, what people might take for granted as a framework. These are things, I'm okay with things like the technology and quantum, those areas, but things like what's a framework are the things I struggle with. So I'll tell you in my way of thinking. So here's what I think of a framework. You build a framework, and then if you're going to build a house, you build a framework, and then the framework describes, once you establish how the framework is going to look, then you know where the bathroom is and the bedroom and the kitchen. And so this is kind of what we're putting together, is that framework. And we argue that the framework is not currently in existence. So we think on our team that we're not doing things optimally because the framework is not clear. We don't have the answer, but we are establishing a path to create the answer. And why do we need the framework, and what should the framework address? Well, these are just 4. There's more areas to consider, but there's the national security question. There's sovereignty. This is represented by the Made in Canada story. This is an example of how to do responsible technology, and the whole area responsible tech and how to do it is subject to research and development itself. And then there's the economy, economic advancement, job growth, that kind of a thing. And so we're going to argue that getting a framework in place is important to be able to get these things right. And what we think is currently that, we are approaching what in a sense are verticals, how do we address national security? How do we address sovereignty? And these are discussions that take place in these areas, but we think that they're a little bit decoupled from each other. So the idea of the framework is, how do we put things together into one cogent, coherent story? Okay, so in order to do it, the first question is, what would be models that we can consider? So, why do all this? Why not just look at a country and say, what do they do? And then just copy what they do. So, and if there's a country out there that gets this emerging dual use tech story right, then we have no work to do. But we don't think that's the case. So as 4 interesting examples, we have the US, China, Singapore, and Israel, and they're very different. And so each one might add, provide some interesting context and information that can inform us. So on the left, these are 2 big countries in competition with each other these days. So one of the drivers in emerging dual use technology, it doesn't state it in a lot of documents, but if you dig deep, not deep, if you dig shallow, you'll see that it is a competition between the 2. And it's interesting because the US and China have very different models. The US has drives things forward, for example, by DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, that funds forward-thinking projects. You want to ask a question? Okay, is that, okay.
Do you allow questions in the middle?
I don't know, ask Anne, she's the chair.
Up to you.
Oh, I'm
It's
okay.
up to you.
Okay, so as you mentioned, that there is no framework existing.
I didn't say there's no framework existing in Canada is the message, yeah. But I'm not saying there's no framework. Yeah, so in a sense, we're going to we look at other countries, their models, and then adapt what they've got and see where the fit is.
So what's the difference between this framework and the models?
The models are, we're saying, the model to me is, like, if we take the American model, so I mentioned DARPA, there's InQtel, which is an investment arm of the CIA. And like other agencies, there's the ecosystem of companies, the white papers that are issued to drive development in tech firms, anything from Hughes Aerospace to Lockheed Martin, et cetera. So there's a model for how they operate, but the model doesn't necessarily include an EDT framework, where EDT is emerging dual use. So good, okay. Can they hear the question, or do I need to repeat a question?
Depends on how loudly everyone
Okay.
speaks, so,
And did you hear the question?
yes.
Yes, okay, then that's fine. So I know I don't need to repeat it. Okay, and then, so, and I just mentioned answering the question about the US as an example. China is much more state-driven in its approach. So kind of like if you need a market with procurement, because the state plays a role in a lot of companies, there's representation by the party and so on. China has a very different model in that it can drive demand through more state-driven efforts, and the ability to insert capital, build infrastructure, et cetera. In say the US, there's a lot of consideration in how to build things, national labs, spaces like you can, for example, Illinois State is investing a lot in developing tech, advanced tech in Chicago and all that. There's a political process that differs a lot with the Chinese one, where things can move a lot quicker. And so it's interesting to compare, and what are the trade-offs in being able to move quicker? Is there a trade-off in other considerations? And then Singapore is interesting because it's a small country. It cares a lot about tech development. As a proportion of GDP, it's a big investor in that. Singapore plays a delicate role, dealing nicely with these two competing superpowers. The population is smaller, so there's also lessons for Canada. And then they have formulated strategies. They have a lot of documents that kind of formulate. In Singapore, there's kind of a framework where there are a lot of principles articulated in different agencies. A-STAR, Advanced Science and Technology Research. I forget exactly what it stands for, but it's a government agency like our NRC, National Research Council. Okay, and then Israel's a very interesting case in a number of ways. There's a civilian-driven side for developing tech. There's a close collaboration between civilian and military development. Within the society, a lot of the people go through military, so they are military, and then they go off to industry, in not every case, of course, but in a lot of cases. And then there's also a dual use question, which is very interesting, because Israel has Palestinian territories that administers, and then the dual use consideration also comes up in the flow of even food from Israel into Palestinian territory. So it's interesting to reality check what dual use is in the context of the Israel-Gaza conflict and the Israel-Palestine dichotomy. So it's interesting on a lot of levels. Okay, so where do the lessons come in for Canada? So in that stack with the Canadian flag on top, it's to give you the idea. That's a picture of the Aurora Borealis. So it's it's in the federal budget, and it's an area of investment, and it stands for Bureau of something like Research and Engineering. What was L stand for? Anybody remember? Leadership, yeah, leadership and innovation, et cetera. So Borealis is seen to be an effort that's addressing the kinds of needs. It's kind of new, and so that's representing the Borealis investment and strategic direction. Canada also, as a smaller player, in the sense of R&D and innovation, needs to work carefully with the G7, NATO, and all other multilateral organizations. So exactly how the fit is, how things are negotiated. The G7, which meant Kamnaz is near Calgary, so I didn't go to the G7, but I was in a number of meetings beforehand. which were very interesting. And the G7 highlighted certain emerging dual-use tech, including quantum. NATO is also doing the same. And so, and you'll hear more about this global landscape from Tracey, but the idea that how does Canada, how much does Canada go on its own versus how much is it a multilateral partnership? In my mind, I always think about if you look at, NASA spacecraft and there's a Canada arm on it. So I feel like we've stitched that one up, that if you want to launch a spacecraft, then it needs an arm, come to Canada. So in my cartoon way of thinking, it's kind of like, do we want to do the equivalent in other EDTs of building the arm for a space shuttle? Or how much do we need to balance sovereign and be alone? With the US, the president of the United States makes comments about annexation. I don't know how real they are, but then there's the question of sovereignty versus that. There's also trade barriers between the US and Canada, like under ITAR. So how much we work multilaterally and how much we work independently are important issues to consider. Okay, so with that, I'll pass over to Tracey to talk about signals of concern and beyond.
So great to be here. I'm going to be starting with a bit of a dire message of diagnostics, running diagnostics in Canada, signals of concern. And the reason I'm doing this is to really highlight the importance of this moment for Canada to get this right, as Barry referred to. And so there's many measures one can choose from. But, to start with, we're looking at Canadian GDP per capita. This is on a purchasing power parity basis. And which should come to no surprise to anyone here that Canada's GDP per capita has been lagging its peer competitors. In fact, that has been, it's actually falling even further behind than its competitors in recent years. In 2022, our GDP per capita and normalized, when we look at the US, was 72%. So 72% is what we're faced with here. And so despite all that, and I'm sorry, I should, in addition to all of that, Canada is actually ranked last if you look at OECD economies and projections forward. And further to that, we're also lagging on important technology indices such as the global AI index. We're also lagging on R&D investment. And again, this is normalized to GDP. And importantly, if you look internationally, if you look at the G7, if you look at NATO and you look at the BRICS, for example, they have all increased their GDP per capita since the year 2000 on average. Canada's relative R&D investment performance has been uneven over that period, but on average, it has declined. So just by a fraction of a percentage. The important point here, though, is that decline, that divergence from the three groups I just mentioned, G7, BRICS, NATO, that's important because at the same time, technology has been increasing in importance and we should be investing there. But as you see, this is divergent in a reverse way. And a slight nuance to this is that science and innovation don't always go hand in hand. And so Canada is also lagging on its patent performance. This slide actually is created from the CIPO conference that just happened last week. And so it's very important to see that Canada, in fact, is pushing out 25% more papers than the US, again, normalized to population. This is, and so we're doing well on science. So that science pivot. So despite what I showed you in the last slide, that we're reducing our investment in R&D relative to others, we're actually doing well on the science side. The concern is turning that into economic prosperity, turning that into commercialization outcomes. And so, as Barry mentioned, I'm going to give you a landscape view of select examples in emerging dual-use technology. So these all partially address part of the governance challenge. I'm focusing here, I have three examples in quantum and one that's more generic to emerging technology. And so we'd start at the upper left with NATO. Interestingly, in that NATO quantum strategy, they do make explicit reference to dual use. The Open Quantum Institute is doing important work in anticipatory governance and multilateral governance. Similarly, if you look below, the OECD also has come out with a framework for anticipatory governance. and a group of leading scholars, so Aboy et al., including, in fact, Maurice Kopp, who's a CIGI, a senior fellow, have come out with a standards first, or calling for a standards first approach to governance. And so there's many more I could mention, you know, the work of the World Economic Forum. We also have frameworks such as the dual use research of concern. So this relates to biosecurity threats that has been in place for quite some time now. You know, Barry made reference to the G7, right? So the G7 in this case in quantum had come up with the G7 common vision for the future quantum technologies. And so all of these are important and bring us some parts of this picture that, you know, will help inform the emerging dual use technologies governance framework. And so one of the other points, I just, one moment, just refer to my notes here. I wanted to make is that, you know, if we look at individual blocks, for example, so like the EU, they're coming out with a EU Quantum Act. And so this is important because, you know, it's referencing, in this case, quantum, but quantum, of course, is an international technology. It's not just Europe, and of course, it has profound dual use implications. So what we really need is more an international lens on this, an international governance, a coherent framework that we can bring forward. And the community is struggling with how to govern not just quantum technologies, but this whole wave of emerging dual use technologies, right? So AI, robotics, biological engineering, and other rapidly developing technologies. So this slide here is really to help inform our view of, you know, what again, running diagnostics on governance challenges. What are the gaps? You may be familiar with the terms pacing challenge and the Collingridge dilemma. So the pacing challenge is technology is rapidly developing. It's developing at the speed of imagination, and policy is moving at the speed of government. Collingridge dilemma is, you know, while, I mean, essentially what we're looking at here is technology is advancing very quickly, and at its infancy, you have more control. When a technology is a nascent development, you have more control over how you can do it, except the consequences are not yet known, right? So it's that presents a dilemma. If you wait until later and you know what the impacts may be of the technology, it's more difficult to steer. And so that's what the pacing and Collingridge dilemma are referring to. We also just need to take a step back and look at emerging dual use technologies and the risks that they present. I mean, right in the name emerging falls right into the Collingridge dilemma, right? We don't know what those applications are going to be of all those emerging technologies. We also know that these are, you know, going to be powerful technologies, right? They're going to have both civilian and military applications. They're going to confer geostrategic advantage, economic prosperity, and, you know, lift up societal well-being. They can also offer an asymmetric power advantage to the nation that leads on their frontier development. They can also be rapidly accelerating, as Barry referred to, and also combine in interesting ways with other technologies. So there's many nuances to emerging dual use technologies. And, you know, governments around the world are confronting this challenge, right? They have multi-pronged mandates. So what that means is that they're trying to advance economic prosperity at the same time, of course, of advancing security. And what we're seeing play out right now with technology, you see this with export controls and trade, tariffs, et cetera, is sometimes you're trading off one for the other, right? Sometimes they're competing with each other. So an example would be, I'm going to trade off security for a near-term economic advantage as a lever. And so as the community struggles through this, we see some fragmentation of efforts, and this is really compounded. We're going to focus on an example of export controls, but you also see it in the investment of dual use research, and also moving forward in terms of some of the commercialization outcomes. And so we put forward that here, this is what we're lacking. The gap is that we need an approach that builds robustness. We need an approach that is inclusive of multi-stakeholders. We need an approach that captures synergies and impacts of this. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Tracy. It's actually nice handing back and forth because it gives you a rest when you're talking. You guys get the variety. Okay, the purpose of this slide is really to talk about delta. And I don't know, I'm used to an area where the deltas are the quantitative change, right? So it's not enough to talk about qualitative, but how much are we going to move the needle in each of different areas? And so that's what the deltas is about. We don't have the answer, but this is our thinking about it. So on the left, this is a picture from Gartner, comes from 2021. And so it's already somewhat out of date, but it gives an idea. And this is Gartner is kind of a future, a forecasting consulting firm. And so in this, they've listed what they consider key emerging technologies, trends impact radar. And then here, I know it's too small to read, but just to give you a feeling, they have interfaces and experiences, productivity revolution, business enablers, which informs thinking about what the deltas are in these areas. Advanced computer vision, edge AI, digital twin, who there are a lot of other examples, cloud AI, et cetera. So it just gives a lot of examples here, and then it radiates out. So quantum computing is quantum computing, to me, it looks like a bullseye target, like throw the dart. And so here at the center, you have low code application platform, and out here, quantum is somehow, you throw the dart, you have to miss the target altogether. I don't know what that means, but it worries me as a quantum computing person. Okay, so this tells us something like, the question would be, can an EDT, emerging dual use tech framework, be useful in enhancing how big a delta takes place on a value chain? How much creation do we do? Where do we fit? Where's the value gain? And then over here, this is another figure. Again, the reference is in the tiny URL, but this one about technology innovation, what do we care about? So in this particular diagram I got off the web, they talk about economic growth and competitiveness, enhanced efficiency, productivity, quality of life, and so on. And then the question would be, well, what are the deltas there? And so the question, which we'll probably never be able to give a great answer to, but probably give a good enough answer, is, figure out which deltas are the most relevant, and then how does the framework feed into enhancing the deltas, the amount of change. So that's the idea here. We want to be able to make quantitative statements. This is going to take us a while. We're bringing in stakeholders in, so it's not like we'll just sit alone in our room and dream it up. It's really a matter of discussing, consulting, and then bringing in through a consensus type approach, what are the priorities and what would make sense. So that's an area that we want to work on. Okay, and then what is the purpose? So we made the guiding frame. What does it help with? Well, so Tracy gave a nice, but at times depressing presentation. Canada's lagging behind on GDP, proportion of GDP investment as a purchasing power parity ratio. Canada is doing great on R&D, so that feels good, but lousy on innovation. And so the message I take away, she's too polite to say it, but I get a little bit depressed, is this: Canada's not doing very well and we're getting worse. So to me, it's a hospital situation. So we're on track. I don't want us to wind up in ICU or something. And so the thing is, the message I take is, in some sense, we're sick. I don't want to make everybody else depressed, and we're getting sicker. So we need the right pill to take. And the right pill is the one that will make us better. And we don't just want to get better, but we also want to get stronger. So to me, it's like, we're going downhill. Does EDT play a role in stopping us from going downhill? And does it, can we do our muscle building gym type stuff to build up? And so we hope the answer is yes. We don't know it, but we're hoping that, this would be a pill to get better and the barbell to be able to get stronger. And then where are we looking for this early on? So there's key issues, and it's, as Tracy said, there's this dichotomy. We got to race like crazy into getting things done. In the US, we've seen dissolution of AI safety bodies, so how much can we afford? So now if we think about the American situation, how much can the US afford the safety stuff to make sure that every member of society is respected, everything is done responsibly, versus a race with other countries where if you're too careful, they get ahead. And actually, Tracy talked a bit about the EU stuff, and I've helped out a lot with European Commission over more than 20 years now. And, so Europe is really good, the digital privacy and so on, but then there's arguments that it's slowed down. So it's a really tough question, how much do you do a Silicon Valley type move fast and break things? And how much do you hold back for responsible and let somebody get ahead? So these are the kinds of issues. There are governance questions that arise. So that word cloud captures some of the elements that we think about with governance. We also have the economic resilience, another word cloud to capture relevant elements. But, how do we make sure, so as Canadians, how do we make sure the Canadian economy is resilient? All kinds of supply chain disruptions occur. In my field, rare earths are really important. Rare earths are not actually rare. There's a lot of costs, including environmental, to developing them. How much trade-off do we do to ensure an economic resilience in a world that's fraught with more geopolitical tension? The dual use story, and I'll tell you again, my personal experience with quantum. So just to tell you this, so I'm a quantum scientist, and then we're investing in quantum. And then the big thing to know is the whole universe is quantum. So we think everything is quantum. And on the other hand, we don't have enough funding in quantum to fund everything. So then you can ask the question, you say, well, what can you do? Like, building this table is a quantum exercise, but you don't need to know quantum mechanics to design the table. So we say, okay, it's not quantum if you don't need to use quantum mechanics to do it. In the end, it's just building a fence. Say, well, here's the dollars for quantum, make a fence. There's insiders and outsiders. Insiders get money. Where do you put the fence to maximize the impact of the investment? And so these aren't scientific questions. The same arises in dual use. It's not like you can just sit down and make a dictionary definition and know what's dual use and what isn't. If you still use a pencil and paper, that's dual use, because in the military, they still write things down. So a pencil is a dual use technology. So getting right where the fence is put, so that like in the federal budget, there's a dual use allocation, knowing what's dual use and what isn't simply a scientific exercise. It's to me, now that I work with a lot of stuff, building an innovation ecosystem, et cetera, it's how do we put that fence in place so that the ones included are both responsible and moving needles, deltas, but you don't spread too thin. And then you always annoy people because, you say, well, you're not really quantum or this or that because of this, but they know they are, because the whole universe is quantum. And we have this in every area. And so the dual use questions come up. This is a technology in the EU. EU, as Tracy mentioned, gives really good examples of documents. Like, the EU is really careful about putting forward framework strategies, all the rest. So it's interesting to study the case. And then there's the investment. And this is what I said about the fence. What's inside or outside the fence? So the dollars and infrastructure, et cetera, you put in yield the most impact in the positive or benevolent areas, and the least impact in the malevolent. So you want your delta to be small or negative in the malevolent cases and positive and large in the benevolent cases. Okay. So now I'm going to pass over to Sabrina, and I'll do the introduction too. So Sabrina is one of the two co-ops on the program. She has a sociology undergraduate degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has done management sciences in University of Waterloo and is here as a co-op. I'll hand over to you to talk about the
My
legal.
side, so in thinking about governance for EDTs, we think it's important to first distinguish between hard law and soft law. So hard law refers to legally binding rules enforceable by the government. Relating to EDTs, things like legislation such as EU's AI Act and international treaties or export controls are considered as hard law. One advantage of hard law is its strong enforceability and compliance, because hard laws carries legal obligations and penalties. For example, in Canada, companies that don't apply to export controls over dual use items will face heavy fines or imprisonment. However, hard laws also carry drawbacks. So they require lengthy legislative and negotiation processes, which makes them slow to adapt to technological changes. For example, the EU wanted to revise revised its dual use regulation in 2016 to address cyber surveillance tools. But it took them nearly 5 years to finally adopt it in 2021. And once hard laws are established, those rules are really difficult to change or amend, and which limits their flexibility in fast evolving fields like AI or quantum. And for international treaties, there's also the issue of uneven implementation and participation across nations. One example for that is the Wassenaar Arrangement, which we'll discuss in the next slide. And soft law, on the other hand, are non-binding principles or guidelines. And our EDT guiding frame will adopt a soft law approach. And the soft law approach is flexible and adaptive, which allows policymakers and industry actors to make rapid adjustments as technology evolves. And for example, the OECD's AI principles provide a voluntary guidance that countries and companies can easily adapt to their own context. And soft laws are also more inclusive, as they can consult and bring together stakeholders from both public and private sectors. And importantly, they are also effective for handling uncertainties. An example for that is the UK's regulatory sandbox which allows the firms to test their AI and fintech products under regulated conditions, so the regulators can observe and study the real-world effects of those technologies. And scholars have also argued that soft law can serve as a complement to hard law, forming a hybrid governance model. For example, a legal scholar from Arizona State University argued that in the US, biotech policy and statutes are reinforced by those non-binding agency guidance and coordination mechanisms, creating a more adaptive and anticipatory framework governing the new technology. And with that, I'll pass it to Skyler, who's also a co-op student at CIGI and a fourth-year student in political science at U Waterloo. And he will speak more on the Wassenaar Arrangement.
The kind of limitations that exist through hard law approaches is the Wassenaar Agreement. Established in 1996 to manage conventional arms and dual-use goods, the Wassenaar Agreement is a legally binding export regime that enforces compliance through export control regulation and control lists. This is agreed upon by 42 states, and it requires unanimous consent, yet they only meet once per year, which has become the bottleneck. As Kevin Wolf, the Assistant Secretary for Export Administration within the Department of Commerce, has said, even modest control list updates, small things, could take 2 to 3 years. And any single state, whether it be Russia or any other member of the Wassenaar Agreement, can veto these options immediately. Which reflects the lengthy process and low flexibility that Sabrina just mentioned. For emerging dual-use technologies, whether that be AI, biotech, or quantum in this example, these rigidity of the Wassenaar Agreement means static, backward-looking control lists, which fail to struggle the new innovation cycles. By the time the technologies have been listed on the control list, global diffusion's already occurred and it's already rapidly underway. This slow pace has enforced countries to adopt something new without the Wassenaar Agreement called Wassenaar -1, which is an approach by the United States and some of its allies to coordinate export control lists unilaterally, or sorry, not unilaterally, plurilaterally, without waiting for formal consent 2 to 3 years down the pipeline with the Wassenaar Agreement. It's faster, it's more adaptive, but it's also fragmented and unevenly enforced. This shift demonstrates that at home practice, the soft law mechanisms, as Sabrina mentioned, are emerging to fill the governance gaps left by flexible hard law. It's a move towards agility, but it also gives up global cohesion. And with that said, scholars in this field like Lou and Hubert have noted that both soft and hard laws present unintended consequences. Anything that you're regulating or controlling are going to have these consequences. The first is leakage and fragmentation. simply firms will just move to less aligned jurisdictions and operate business there like nothing happened. The second is overreach. So overly broad or misaligned countries can slow the domestic innovation within their own countries, or in some cases, they can accelerate the foreign competitors. For example, when we tightened semiconductors and advanced computing regulations, China just spurred down on their indigenous R&D, strengthening that self-sufficiency drive within their own nation. This can be seen through examples like DeepSeek, which despite all the export regulations, continues to excel. And the last one is talent and research implications. So with these controls, these rigid and risky export controls, it discourages collaboration in universities and the research networks more broadly, which is especially problematic for a lot of the emerging dual-use technologies we talk about, the frontier technologies that depend on open cross-border knowledge exchange. So in 2025, the Wassenaar Agreement is still legitimate, but its effectiveness and its efficiency is what's deteriorating. The rigidity, the hard law aspect is what is deteriorating. The hard law approach is slow, static, and exclusionary, and has given way for the soft law coordination with through nations and plurilateral approach that is faster, but again, fragmented. The key challenge now is to stabilize this new plurilateral model to make it consistent enough to enforce gaps, yet flexible enough to manage that uncertainty without stifling the innovation at home. Now that I've given you some context as to what soft law and hard law is and some examples here, I'll pass it back to Barry to discuss our approach starting with the foundations.
Okay, thanks, Skylar and Sabrina. Okay, so this is the next slide. Okay, so I can't get the physicists out of me. So let me just explain why people go into physics, and that'll explain the slide. So what drives people to do physics is get to the bottom of it. So we think, and I'll just say at the outset, it's not necessarily the right way to think, but we often think that, you know, as long as you figure out what the particles are in the universe, everything else is straightforward. So once we realize everything is made of electrons and quarks and gluons and photons, everything we're doing in the room is trivial. That's kind of a physics way of thinking. So it's always sounds very arrogant, but not every physicist thinks that way. But because I'm trained that way, I'm thinking, okay, how do we get to the bottom of the whole emerging dual use technology and the guiding framework for it? Let's go down to the particle physics, but this is a particle physics of the social sciences. And so the idea here is what is the view and the perspective in various areas? What does an economist think of emerging dual use tech? What does a sociologist think? What does an anthropologist think? What does a legal scholar think? Et cetera, et cetera. And so these are somewhat captured under the STS, Science and Technology Studies. And so the idea is, how do we gather that together? So often what I see is there are approaches to develop frameworks that start higher in the stack. So instead of going back through the social sciences, kind of saying, well, here is, and this goes back to the model, you know, here are models to proceed. But it's really nice, and part of what we want to do is to bring together the different communities. One of my favorites is talking to economists about this, and I've gone to a couple of economics meetings about quantum information technology. But the idea is that, okay, so one guy I talked to about this is Avi Goldfarb at the University of Toronto, and he's in economics and in the Rotman Business School. And so he tells me that economists are blind to dual use. So if you think about traditional economics and, you know, incentivization, market pull, et cetera, what distinguishes defense from other areas, right? So if you go to an economist and you say the investment is needed for security, and you put that in an economics paradigm, it's not so straightforward. And we'll talk a bit about theory of change, but if you go to a sociologist and then, you know, theory of change emerges out of a systems theory, but you're a technological determinist or an actor network theory person or whatever, what is the perspective? And I can go on and on through each discipline. And I try to talk to each area in the social sciences to get the perspective, but these are tough questions that challenge some of the paradigms. So going back to the foundational research in areas of social science and figuring out what emerging dual use technology means through those lenses is important. And it's also important to realize there's no right answer here. You know, it's a matter of gathering the different perspectives, recognizing each one is grounded in different axioms, and then to develop the framework, recognizing that. And then my own feeling is we tend to, again, like I said, I'm kind of an outsider coming in, but I feel sometimes the different perspectives are left out, possibly because we regard, you know, the foundation to be at a higher level. But this one of the foundations is going to the bottom. So it's what I think of as the particle physics of our project. And then, of course, we need to be able to consider it from the range of STEM. So we've got the science, technology, mathematics, and engineering to be able to have those representations. And it's interesting going into this because there's the whole technoscience paradigm as well, right? So within sociology and in the area of technology dynamics, even talking about science and engineering as different disciplines doesn't hold. If you think of an actor network framework with like Bruno Latour, you know, in France, who did outstanding work on analyzing that the technoscience framework, questions that because in a graph structure, there's so much interplay between them that can you separate the two? And so the idea that in STEM, there are the 4 disciplines, and then what we're doing has to recognize the complexity that these are intertwined in ways that might not even be separable and get that built into the theory. So this intellectually, this is the very fun part of the project. Everything else is good, but this is the one that gets me out of bed in the morning. Okay, so now how are we going to do it? So we hinted before, but these pictures are meant to capture what we're trying to do. Even though I raised questions about theory of change, it is a standard and it's a well-developed area to be able to deliver the benefit. So we do have plans to employ a theory of change approach, and this is a strength here and at CIGI to be able to use that. So I want to be able to ask fundamental questions about it, but at the same time employ that. Okay, and then what are we going to produce? Well, we're going to talk a lot. So there's workshop approaches, and the workshops will bring people together, but also talking is a way of being able to disseminate the information. So if and when we get answers to things, then we will work towards training to get these things clear. So there's that kind of communication, just what we're doing in this room. Lots of publications. So at the end, there'll be a stack of publications, and then by some KPI, key performance indicator, that indicates success. But on here's the high tech. We'll produce a video or something, old fashioned, but you know, who knows? We could dominate TikTok with our shorts on how to do emerging dual-use tech. And then the idea to produce a template. So one that we've looked at is the World Economic Forum does templates. So it was really interesting going through it because, you know, if you want to set up a governance model and all that, don't bother doing everything from scratch. There's a template out there, just fit it in. So you can construct your governance model in 5 minutes. Whether it's a good one, I don't know, but you can certainly make something like that. And then the idea too is to have sandboxes. So this is a regulatory sandbox, and regulations are important. And then if we think about how to construct the sandboxes, so they're operated securely, they're representative of what would happen, and regulators, instead of having to be fed, you know, a sack of papers, really have a chance to simulate what's going on under appropriate conditions to test. So these are the kinds of things that we imagine producing. It's multimodal, many modal. Okay, and then for the framework, it's important to get the principles right, not too many of them, but just find the sweet spot. And so this is using this free word cloud generator.com, feed in a bunch of words, and then it generates a word cloud. And so this is a number of key words that can be very important for being able to derive the principles that are the foundation of the framework. And so these are things that we think about: openness, human-centric, incentives, transparency, norms, etc. So that word cloud just kind of is a menu of items to draw from to be able to then describe, to construct the underlying principles, which will be developed on a consensus basis. That's you now. Okay, so I'll pass back to Tracey for the impacts.
All right. So with this slide, I have to give due credit to our program manager, she's over there, I can see her, Grace Wright, who brought her own intellectual contribution to the formation of this project. So thank you, Grace. So what we have here on this slide are three buckets, if you will, of where we anticipate there to be impact as a result of having an emerging dual use framework. And so on the left, you will see this is representative technology development and diffusion. And so, I mentioned earlier, the rapid development of technology and how that is a challenge for our existing governance framework. So, by building these, but building a framework that provides clarity, that is, I should mention, there's responsibility infused across all three of these areas of application. We're looking to affect not only the development and diffusion of technology, but its responsible development. And in the second area here of impact, this is the applications of emerging technology. So here, what we're looking to do, of course, is as Barry referenced, the benevolent applications. We're looking to steer technology so that we're being responsible, and we're focusing here on health and environmental applications, as you can see, but also could be in finance. And, through guidance around the strategic investment in dual use technology, we optimally hope to serve these beneficial applications, but also ensure that we're doing it in an optimal manner, we're being good stewards of our finance. And so that's what the second bucket refers to. And then the third references geo-competition and international alignment. Canada has an important role to play and has served an important role in terms of global norm setting. And so by producing a guiding framework for emerging dual use technologies in such a way that Barry mentioned, we hope to be building this international alignment and clarity around how we approach emerging dual use. And I believe the next slide is mine as well. So very, very briefly, I just wanted to signal, again, Barry mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation that, we are just early days in this project, and this is effectively a map for you of where we intend to go to next. And so here, this is our future outlook. We've referenced already that, there's definitional ambiguity around what is emerging, what is dual use, what is emerging dual use. So we are currently undertaking research. Sabrina Chen is central to that effort in defining these terms. And then we're also looking at a case study of the quantum export control case that Skylar was describing with Boston R-1. And what lessons can we draw from that? That it's actually under development, as we say, right? Like as we speak, it's evolving, this situation around quantum export controls. And then fundamentally, the third question, right? How do we govern this whole wave of emerging dual use technologies? And how do we do that in a responsible way? As I mentioned, we want to, of course, be respectful of human rights. We, of course, want to, as I mentioned earlier, promote societally beneficial applications. But, we also have to be cognizant of the very real security interests, the economic prosperity. We need to find this way to work through the promote, protect dichotomy and do that in a balanced way, get this right. Fourth and fifth, I see. So I put in some questions and then Barry kind of drilled in with a bold highlight here. So this fourth question is relates to this anticipatory concept, right? You've seen championed by the Open Quantum Institute, also with, I mentioned the OECD has that anticipatory framework. So what should Canada do here, right? What kind of defense policy adjustments should we be looking at as it relates to, in this case, in particular, AI and quantum technologies? And then finally, building resilience. Often you hear about this in the reference to economic resilience. So here we're looking at supply chains, which has a lot embedded in it. That's a lot of trade measures and vulnerabilities and choke points. And how do we do this in a way that incentivizes global cooperation so it's overall more effective?
Yes. Good news, last slide. Okay, first, I didn't see back there, Grace, but just to give a shout out that Grace program manager, but as we started the project, Grace played a major role in getting these concepts right and bringing a team together. So shout out to Grace. Okay, this is just a summary. So what's the take home message? So one is, the idea of this EDT, emerging dual use technology framework is it can feed into economic development. That was the pill and the barbell picture, it can cure, we hope, like maybe it's dreaming big, but we hope that it can cure, or at least partially cure, what ails Canada as we're on this downhill trend that Tracy showed, and it can strengthen us, the barbell side. So this is the economic development story. Also, it addresses key issues that we're identifying to do with society, sovereignty, and security. And finally, what we need what we're doing. So we claim this is a good effort, worthwhile, because Canada needs it. Thanks.